Liam had always trusted his wife, Natalie, without hesitation. They'd been together for over a decade, building a life that seemed near perfect from the outside. Both had successful careers, friends who admired their relationship, and evenings filled with laughter and routine comfort. But over the past few months, that foundation started to feel unsteady. It began subtly. Natalie, once punctual and predictable, started coming home late with no clear explanation. She claimed long hours, saying her company had more work than ever. Yet Liam noticed her excuses didn't quite add up. She'd come home late on evenings that weren't project deadlines, wear clothes that didn't match her usual corporate look, and sometimes even smelled faintly of a cologne that wasn't his. Her excuses were so well-practiced and nonchalant that he felt almost guilty for suspecting anything. But each time she breezed past his questions, a flicker of doubt would ignite in his mind, and before long, it became a quiet flame of suspicion he couldn't put out. Then there was the restaurant. Natalie had always loved dining out, often inviting Liam to her favorite spots on their date nights. Recently, though, she mentioned a new place, a small, romantic bistro tucked away downtown. She'd rave about the menu, the wine selection, and how charmingly intimate it felt. But she never invited him to join. At first, she made it sound like it was a work hangout, but as weeks passed, her stories became murkier, details changed, and the suspicion gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. One night, after tossing and turning beside Natalie as she lay asleep, Liam made up his mind. He would go to that restaurant himself, maybe see if he could find out what drew her there so often. Little did he know that his decision would unravel a truth far beyond anything he could have prepared for. The next day, Liam went about his day as usual, but his mind raced with plans. How would he do this? Just walk in and pretend to be another diner? He realized he needed more than just a glance. He needed evidence. He wanted clarity and closure, not only for his sake, but for the marriage they'd spent years building. In a stroke of inspiration, he remembered a friend from college, Jonah, who owned a small security firm. After work, he gave Jonah a call, filling him in briefly on the situation, but without any emotional details. Jonah listened intently, then offered a surprising suggestion. Why don't you just work there as a waiter for a night or two? If she's really coming in as often as you think, you'll see her, Jonah said. Liam hesitated. The thought was ludicrous and would require a serious commitment, but as he mulled it over, he felt a strange sense of resolve. He was always the logical, methodical type. This was about as far outside his comfort zone as he could imagine going, but he needed to do it. That night, he walked into the restaurant, introduced himself as a local, and asked the manager if he might need extra hands. They were short-staffed, the manager admitted, and after a few questions and some small talk, the job was his. Liam was stunned by how easy it was to slip into this alternate identity, even if only temporarily. The plan was set. The next few days, Liam trained as a waiter. His coworkers were friendly but kept to themselves, which suited him fine. As each shift passed, he watched every couple and studied every table, waiting for her familiar silhouette to walk through the door. Every time he imagined what he might do when he saw her, how he'd feel, he pushed the thought away, burying it beneath his focus on the job. Then, finally, on the third night, Natalie walked in, and she wasn't alone. Liam's heart froze as he watched her glide into the dimly lit dining room. She looked stunning, more radiant than he'd seen her in months. He could hardly believe that this was the same woman who often left him sitting at the dinner table with an excuse about work or an early morning. She was laughing, her hand resting on the arm of a man Liam had never seen before. Tall, well-dressed, with a certain arrogance in his posture. They took their seats at a secluded corner table, her fingers lingering a moment too long on his as they got comfortable. Liam forced himself to stay calm, even as emotions clashed within him. Hurt, anger, betrayal. He swallowed hard, gathered his composure, and approached their table. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and even. Natalie didn't even look up. She was too engrossed in her company to notice that her husband was the one holding the pen and pad, ready to take their order. "What would you like to start with?" Liam asked, keeping his eyes on her. He could feel the pulse in his veins, loud and insistent. It was surreal. watching her like this from a perspective he'd never imagined possible. Finally, she looked up and froze. Natalie's face went white as her eyes met Liam's. The confident smile she'd worn just seconds before slipped, replaced by a look of shock so profound that she barely remembered to breathe. For a moment, her mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. The man sitting across from her looked between them, oblivious, sensing only the tension but not understanding its source. Liam watched her, his expression carefully neutral, though his heart was pounding. He gave her a moment, the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement of the game she'd been playing. He wanted her to speak first, to offer him some kind of explanation, no matter how hollow it would surely be. But she just sat there, stunned. Are you ready to order?" he asked quietly, his tone unflinching. Natalie blinked, glancing desperately at her companion as if for some lifeline, some cue for how to proceed. "Why, yes, of course," she stammered, forcing a smile so strained it looked almost painful. She fumbled with the menu, her hands shaking as she tried to hold onto her composure. "We'll start with the red wine," her companion said, oblivious, leaning back in his chair with an easy arrogance. "A bottle of your best, please." Liam nodded, scribbling down the order as if this was any other night, as if this was any other couple. He could feel Natalie's gaze darting back to him, caught in the net of lies she'd spun so seamlessly until tonight. But he refused to look her way again. "Excellent choice," he said, voice steady. "I'll get that right out for you." He walked away, feeling her eyes on him until he rounded the corner, finally out of sight. In the kitchen, Liam leaned against the counter, taking deep breaths, steadying himself against the tidal wave of emotions flooding over him. All the subtle signs, the late nights, the dismissive explanations, it all made sense now. And yet, knowing the truth did nothing to soften the blow. It just made it more real. One of his coworkers glanced over at him, noticing his expression. "You good?" she asked. Liam forced a nod, flashing a smile he didn't feel. "All good. Just first time dealing with high-maintenance customers, I guess." She chuckled. "Well, get used to it. That table in particular gets a lot of special treatment." That comment stung, but Liam filed it away, determined to stay focused on his plan. He went back to the bar, grabbed the wine, and headed back to the table. When he approached, Natalie looked up at him, a wordless plea in her eyes. But he offered no hint of sympathy. This was her moment to say something, to break the silence between them. But instead, she shrank under his gaze, looking away. Liam opened the wine with a steady hand, pouring the glasses with an ease that felt surreal in the midst of his turmoil. The man, oblivious to the tension, took his glass and raised it with a smirk. "To secrets," he said with a chuckle, clinking his glass against Natalie's. She managed a hollow smile, barely brushing her glass against his. Liam gave her one last look as he stepped away. There was no need for words now. They both knew the facade was shattered, and there would be no putting it back together. Liam stepped away from the table, but his heart felt anchored there, tethered by the painful weight of the truth now hanging between them. As he returned to his station, he fought against the rising urge to turn back, to confront Natalie right there in front of her lover and every patron in that restaurant. But no, that's what she wanted. A scene to control, to twist into her own story. He would not give her that satisfaction. Instead, he resolved to end his shift and wait outside until she left. The minutes dragged on as he filled other orders, took notes, and delivered meals, each task a small, absurd detail in the midst of his internal storm. When he finally caught sight of them from across the room, they were eating, seemingly absorbed in their meal. He noted the way her lover leaned in, his hand casually resting on her arm. Liam's eyes traced every intimate movement, every hint of familiarity he'd once thought was his alone. The truth was so vivid and undeniable now, and yet it still felt like he was watching someone else's life unfold, a stranger's heartbreak, not his own. Every fiber of him wanted to intervene, to make her explain herself. But he held back, his resolve strengthened by the knowledge that he held the upper hand for once. He had seen her, caught her without a shadow of a doubt, and for the first time, she had nothing to hide behind. As their meal neared its end, Liam braced himself, finally ready to close out his shift. With a quick word to the manager, he left early, changing in the staff room before heading outside. He waited at the end of the street, leaning against a lamp post, his eyes on the entrance to the restaurant. A few patrons trickled out, but not Natalie. His patience wore thin as the minutes stretched into an hour, and he wondered if she knew he'd be waiting for her, delaying her exit. Then, finally, she appeared, arm in arm with her lover, the two of them laughing quietly as they stepped onto the dimly lit sidewalk. Natalie glanced nervously around, but Liam was hidden by shadows, watching them make their way to the nearby lot. When they reached her lover's car, she leaned into him, and they exchanged a kiss that felt too intimate, too practiced. Liam looked away, feeling a hollow ache, a grief that seemed to swallow him whole. It was one thing to suspect she was unfaithful, but to witness it, to see her betray him so brazenly, was something else entirely. Once they separated and the car disappeared into the night, Liam moved toward her. She hadn't noticed him yet, fumbling with her keys, probably thinking the night was over and that her secret was intact. Natalie. She froze at the sound of her name. Slowly, she turned, eyes widening as she saw him standing there, unflinching, under the pale streetlight. Liam, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. He took a step closer, his face betraying none of the rage boiling within. You and I need to talk, he said firmly, his voice carrying an unmistakable finality. And as the color drained from her face, Liam saw the truth he'd feared all along. She was caught, and she had nowhere left to hide. Natalie looked down, her shoulders tense as she tried to gather herself, but her voice came out in a low, barely controlled tremble. Liam, I can explain. Really? He replied, his voice steady, almost calm. He took a step closer, not letting her escape his gaze. Then explain it. Right here, right now. Explain why I've been watching my own wife laugh, flirt, and kiss another man. Tell me, Natalie, why did you do this? She took a shaky breath, her eyes darting down the empty street, as if she hoped to spot someone who could rescue her from the moment. When she looked back at him, her face held a mix of guilt and frustration, almost like she was irritated to have been found out. It's not what you think. It's complicated. He felt a rush of anger, something almost primal, rise in his chest. Complicated. That word struck him harder than anything else she could have said. She'd taken their life, their marriage, something he devoted himself to building, and dismissed her betrayal with a single, evasive word. Complicated? You're seeing someone else, Natalie. You're lying to me every single day. And I'm supposed to just stand here and accept that it's complicated? His voice was rising, but he held it in check, forcing himself to remain steady, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. She looked away, tears pooling in her eyes. You don't understand, Liam. It's not just. Look, things between us haven't been right for a long time. Liam took a step back, stunned. Her words felt like a slap, each one tearing away the fragile layer of disbelief he'd clung to. So that's your excuse? He asked, his voice hollow. You feel things aren't right, so you decide to go out and replace me? It wasn't like that, she said, her voice pleading. She reached out, but he stepped back, refusing to let her touch him. She dropped her hand, biting her lip. I've been feeling lost. I felt like you were distant. I don't know. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. He stared at her, his heart breaking as he realized that she was trying to twist this, to put the blame back on him. Distant? He let out a bitter laugh. I've been distant? I'm the one who's been staying home, waiting for you while you're out with him. I'm the one who's been putting in the work, believing every lie you fed me, while you were sneaking around. And you have the audacity to say it's because I'm distant? Natalie closed her eyes, as if she could will herself out of this confrontation. I just didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? His voice broke, and he let a moment of vulnerability slip through. Do you have any idea what it feels like to see you with him? To watch the woman I thought I knew laughing with another man? He swallowed, feeling the weight of his emotions bear down on him. You didn't think about me, Natalie. You thought about yourself. Her silence was her only answer. The street around them felt empty and vast, as if they were the last two people in the world. And as they stood there, staring at each other, Liam realized that the woman before him was not the same person he'd married. The silence stretched between them, thick with all the words left unsaid over the years. For a moment, neither of them moved. Liam watched Natalie carefully, searching her face for a trace of the woman he once knew, someone he could still recognize, maybe even forgive. But all he saw now was a stranger, a woman whose betrayal had shattered the life they had built. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice steady but hollow. This isn't something you can just explain away, Natalie. I'm not here to listen to excuses about how complicated this is. I'm here to decide if there's even a future left for us. And right now, he trailed off, struggling to keep the storm of emotions at bay. Liam, please, she whispered, stepping closer. Her eyes were red, glistening with tears she hadn't let fall yet. Don't do this here. Let's go home. Let's talk about it. I'll tell you everything. I'll be honest. Just don't throw it all away over one mistake. One mistake? Liam's voice was barely above a whisper, filled with incredulity. He shook his head, the anger flaring again. This isn't one mistake, Natalie. This is months of lies, sneaking around, and looking me in the eyes every day like nothing was wrong. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. A series of choices, over and over. He could see her struggling to come up with a response, but no words came. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her, her shoulders drooping as she looked away, unable to meet his eyes. For a brief moment, Liam almost felt sorry for her. This woman who'd been so sure of herself, reduced now to silence and shame. I need to know, he said after a pause, his tone hardening. Is this still happening? Are you still seeing him? Her face paled, and she glanced away, a slight hesitation that told him everything he needed to know. But she finally shook her head. No, it's over, Liam. I ended it. I couldn't do it anymore. And when, exactly, did you decide you couldn't do it anymore? His voice was laced with a bitterness that felt foreign to him. Was it last night? Last week? Or was it the moment you saw me standing there, watching you? She didn't answer, and Liam felt another piece of his heartbreak. Here's how this is going to go, Natalie. He squared his shoulders, feeling a surge of strength through the pain. You're going to tell me everything. Every detail, every lie, every moment you spent with him. And then, I'll decide if I can even look at you after tonight. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head. Liam, please, there's no point in dredging it all up. I'll tell you it's over, that I regret it. But do you really need to know every single thing? Can't we just move forward? Move forward? He couldn't help the short, bitter laugh that escaped. Move forward with what, Natalie? A marriage built on lies? A life where I wonder every time you leave the house if I'm the one you're lying to, or if there's someone else. Natalie's face crumpled, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. I don't want to lose you, Liam. I made a mistake. Then you'll tell me, he cut in, his voice unyielding. You'll tell me everything, or you'll lose me right now. That's the choice you've left us with. She opened her mouth, searching for a way out, but realized there was none. The defiance in her gaze faded, replaced by a look of resignation, and she nodded. Fine, she whispered. I'll tell you. Liam didn't feel relief. He didn't feel anything at all, as though the weight of this revelation had numbed him completely. He only knew that whatever came next, he couldn't return to who he'd been before tonight. The next morning, Liam woke up in the guest room, barely remembering when he'd finally collapsed into sleep. He'd left Natalie sitting on the edge of their bed after she'd confessed to everything. She'd poured out details he never wanted but needed to hear. The long lunches, the stolen nights in hotels, the whispered promises that were never meant for him. She tried to explain, to offer reasons and apologies, but by the end, her words sounded hollow and self-serving. When she was finished, he'd walked out, leaving her there in silence. Now, in the light of day, he felt raw, empty, like a shell of himself. But he also felt a strange resolve. He would rebuild himself by removing every trace of her from his life. He showered and dressed in clothes he didn't usually wear, finding some satisfaction in the small rebellion. When he reached for his phone, he made his first change. He deleted every message from her, thousands of texts, a record of years of inside jokes, holiday plans, mundane exchanges, all gone in seconds. Next, he unfollowed her on every social media platform, blocking her profile as he went. The photos of vacations, birthdays, little snapshots of their life together. He'd delete those, too, but later, when it wouldn't hurt as much to see her face. As he walked downstairs, he glanced at the photos on the wall, pictures of the two of them from their engagement, their wedding, and other memories they'd carefully chosen to frame. He took each one down and set them aside, face down on the counter. The walls looked strange without them, bare and impersonal, but the emptiness was freeing. He continued in the kitchen, where he found her favorite mug, her monogrammed wine glass, even a pair of oven mitts she'd bought on a whim. One by one, he took these small, tangible reminders and placed them in a box he intended to store in the garage. It struck him that erasing someone from your life wasn't an act of rage or even of strength. It was an act of survival. By mid-morning, the house was quieter, stripped of the life they'd shared. He moved through each room with a focus he hadn't felt in years, purging the clothes she'd left draped over chairs, the books she'd dog-eared and left on tables, the notes she'd written him over the years, all of it destined for the box. When he opened her closet and saw her dresses hanging in neat rows, her shoes stacked just so, it felt surreal, like he was invading a stranger's space. In the living room, he glanced at her bookshelf, full of novels she'd loved, a hobby he'd always supported even if he didn't share it. He decided he'd donate them. To him, they were weights tethered to the woman who had betrayed him, and he didn't want them in his house any longer. The last step was practical. He pulled out a folder with their shared accounts, joint finances, insurance policies, an endless tangle of paperwork that bound their lives together. He spent hours on the phone, canceling her access, closing accounts, rerouting statements to his personal email. Every confirmation felt like an anchor lifting, a step closer to the freedom he craved. By evening, the house was stripped down to the bare essentials. Her things were gone, and it looked different, hollowed out yet clean. He took a deep breath and walked to the back patio, sitting on the steps as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. Liam knew the journey was far from over. He would have to face her in legal proceedings, maybe even see her around town. But in that moment, with her gone from his life, he felt something he hadn't felt since before the betrayal. He felt like he was finally, truly himself again. For the next few days, Liam settled into the quiet rhythm of his altered life. Each morning felt a little lighter without Natalie's things around, without the constant reminders of a shared life now shattered. He began to fill his time with things he'd long put aside: early morning runs, breakfasts at the local cafe, evenings reading or working on projects that had been gathering dust in his garage. Slowly, he was rediscovering himself outside of his marriage, outside of the person he had tried so hard to be for her. One evening, he found himself at the cafe later than usual. It was nearly empty except for a few regulars, and the owner, Carla, came over to his table with a friendly smile, setting down a coffee refill without him asking. "You look different lately, Liam," she said, studying him with a gentle curiosity. "I don't mean just because you've been coming here more. You seem unburdened." He hadn't shared his situation with anyone except for his brother, who had been furious on his behalf, but Liam had appreciated Carla's kindness over the years. She and her husband, Tom, had owned the cafe since he'd moved to town, and they'd watched him and Natalie grow together, always greeting them with warmth whenever they came in for coffee on lazy Saturday mornings. Liam considered what to tell her, then nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "It's been a rough few weeks, Carla. I found out some things about Natalie, things that changed everything." His voice softened, still weighed down by the betrayal even though he'd erased her from his life. "I think I'm finally done trying to pretend I can make it work." Carla nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "Sometimes, letting go is the bravest thing we can do, Liam. Not everyone's meant to stay with us forever. But you're still here, and that's a good start." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than he expected. Letting go was brave. Maybe it was brave to rebuild his life from the ground up, one small decision at a time, until he'd created something that was truly his again. As he left the cafe, the evening air felt cooler, almost refreshing. He realized he had been holding his breath for weeks, bracing for the next hurt, the next discovery, the next painful step in dismantling his marriage. But now, there was nothing left for her to take. His house, his mind, and his heart were as free as they could be after such a loss. The next day, he decided to return to his old gym, a place he hadn't gone in years. Exercise had once been a form of release, a way for him to clear his mind, and he found himself craving that now more than ever. He pushed himself through weights, cardio, even a boxing class, relishing the way his body responded to the challenge. Each movement was a step forward, a release of the anger, the betrayal, and the hurt. After his workout, he sat on a bench outside the gym, watching the world move around him. He felt a calmness settle over him that he hadn't known in years, a kind of stillness he hadn't thought he'd feel again. As the sun set behind the trees, he realized that he was no longer anchored to the past. He still had wounds to heal, memories to work through, and a life to rebuild, but the weight was his to carry, on his own terms. His future was his alone, unmarked by her betrayal, and though it felt daunting, it also felt good. It was a new beginning, one that was his alone to shape. And for the first time since Natalie's confession, he felt truly, unmistakably alive. Liam's focus shifted fully to his own world, something he'd neglected for far too long. With each passing day, he dedicated himself to things that made him feel stronger and more self-reliant. His house, once a shared space full of reminders of his past, became his fortress. He began repainting rooms, replacing furniture, adding small touches that felt distinctly his. It was as if he were building new walls around himself, both literally and metaphorically. On weekends, he took on DIY projects he'd always wanted to try but had left for someday. He replaced shelves in the kitchen, fixed creaky doors, sanded down the old dining table, and restored it into something fresh. Each improvement, each repaired corner, felt like reclaiming pieces of himself. His home was becoming a space he could finally enjoy, unmarked by memories he wished he could forget. But with every brushstroke and every hammer blow, Liam realized that he was still carrying the weight of betrayal. Every once in a while, something small, a song on the radio, the smell of her perfume lingering on an old sweater, would bring the pain rushing back. He knew he needed to face the emotional scars head-on rather than letting them build walls inside him. One evening, Liam received a call from his brother, Mike, who knew just how deeply Natalie's betrayal had cut him. Mike suggested therapy, gently pushing him toward a path of introspection and healing. At first, Liam resisted. He'd never been one to bare his soul to anyone, let alone a stranger, but as the days passed, he found himself considering it. Finally, he made an appointment with a therapist, Dr. Louise Harrington. At their first session, he felt awkward and defensive, unsure of how much to share. But Dr. Harrington was patient, guiding him to confront feelings he'd kept buried. Session by session, he began to let down his guard, revealing the pain and anger that lingered beneath his surface calm. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where he could let go of the burden he'd been carrying alone. Gradually, he began to see himself not as a victim but as a man with the power to rebuild his life, scars and all. Therapy helped him accept that grief, anger, and even love were part of the journey forward. In the following weeks, Liam reached out to old friends he hadn't seen in years, people who had faded from his life as he'd prioritized his marriage above all else. He rekindled friendships that felt both familiar and new, rediscovering a version of himself he hadn't known he'd lost. One evening, he joined his friends for a camping trip, a tradition he'd abandoned long ago. Around the campfire, as they shared stories and laughter, Liam felt himself letting go of the weight he'd carried for so long. His friends didn't push him to talk about Natalie. They just welcomed him back, giving him the space he needed to find himself again. That night, under a sky full of stars, he felt a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. Months passed, and with each day, Liam grew stronger. His mornings began with a routine he looked forward to, a run through the nearby trails, a cup of coffee at his favorite cafe, followed by work on his own projects. He realized he wanted to do more than just work a 9 to 5. He wanted a life full of purpose, passion, and experiences that were solely his. With that in mind, Liam decided to start a small business, something he dreamed of for years but had always put on hold. He'd been drawn to woodworking since his college days, finding satisfaction in the precision and creativity it required. With encouragement from his therapist and friends, he took the leap, starting a small custom furniture business from his garage. It became a source of pride, a symbol of his ability to build something meaningful on his own. One weekend, Liam received a letter from Natalie. She hadn't contacted him since the divorce was finalized, and the letter surprised him. She wrote of her regrets, her apologies, and even her wish to meet, to find closure for both of them. As he read her words, he felt a familiar sting, but this time, it was muted, softened by the months of growth he'd experienced since she'd left. After some reflection, Liam knew he didn't need to see her. He'd made his peace without her involvement. In his own quiet ritual, he took the letter, folded it gently, and placed it in the box with the last few remnants of their life together. Then he took the box to a storage unit he'd rented, leaving it there, out of sight and out of mind. This act of physically letting go felt symbolic, a final chapter closed on a story he no longer wished to revisit. He walked away, feeling lighter, liberated from the shadows of the past. With his past finally behind him, Liam embraced the future he was crafting day by day. His business grew steadily, and with each new project, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He took on commissions from clients all over the town, forming connections and building a reputation he was proud of. He also began volunteering at a local community center, helping others learn woodworking skills, sharing what he'd found to be a source of healing. One evening, while setting up for a community event, he met someone, Emma, a kind, down-to-earth woman with a warmth that instantly put him at ease. She wasn't intrusive or overly curious about his past. She was just open, inviting him to be himself without pretense. They started as friends, sharing coffee, late-night talks, and laughter that felt genuine and free. As months went by, Liam found himself smiling more, looking forward to their conversations, feeling a spark he thought he'd lost forever. Emma never pushed, never prodded. She accepted him as he was, and that alone was enough to make him feel whole. Standing in his workshop one evening, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the window, Liam felt a deep, quiet contentment. His life was different now, full of scars, yes, but also of growth, resilience, and possibilities he hadn't imagined. He'd turned his pain into strength, and with that strength, he'd rebuilt a life that was unmistakably his own. In the end, he'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending the pain hadn't existed. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and transforming it into something that gave him a new purpose. His life was his again, and whatever lay ahead, he felt ready to meet it with open arms, a heart newly whole.